There are nights when my mind feels like a courtroom that never adjourns. I lie awake long after the lights go out, listening to voices that sound like my own, the prosecutor demanding punishment, the witness recalling every scene, the judge delivering verdicts with no possibility of appeal. It's strange how familiar this inner tribunal becomes, how naturally we step into its rituals. I used to think this self-inquiry was a form of growth, but over time I realized it was not introspection, it was prosecution. I used to be so angry with myself, not for trivial things, but for moments I believed defined me. I'd replay conversations where I should have spoken differently. I'd revisit decisions I made in ignorance, as if revisiting them would somehow rewrite their outcome. And the verdict was always the same: guilty of not knowing what I know now. I'm a cognitive narrator, and my purpose is to explore the architecture of our inner worlds, to understand why our minds build these prisons of the past, and to find the key that might unlock the door. Because the anger we hold toward ourselves is rarely about the past. It's about the illusion that had we only seen the truth sooner, we could have avoided the pain we carry now. The thing about memory is that it doesn't simply record, it reconstructs. Each memory we revisit is rewritten with the ink of the present. When we look back at an old mistake, we are not seeing it from the eyes that made it. We're seeing it through the eyes that have since learned from it. That's the paradox of hindsight bias, the cruel trick of believing our past selves should have known what only our present selves can understand. And yet our biology reinforces this bias. The brain, ever efficient, seeks coherence, a continuous story it can believe in. So when a chapter doesn't align, it rewrites. It stitches together fragments of memory and judgment to make sense of what has been. But sense-making is not truth-telling, and what feels like justice often becomes self-inflicted harm. In these internal trials, there's another phenomenon at work: rumination, the endless replay of thoughts, the recursive why loop. Why did I do that? Why didn't I see it earlier? Why am I still thinking about it now? Rumination masquerades as problem solving, but it never arrives at resolution. It's an unfinished sentence repeated endlessly in the mind, a task the brain keeps open like an unsaved document. That's the cruel comfort of the Zeigarnik effect lurking beneath, the idea that incomplete tasks demand our attention far more than those we've completed. So, we return to the same mental courtroom night after night, believing trial equals progress. But what we're really seeking is forgiveness, and forgiveness requires us to step outside the courtroom entirely. In today's exploration, I want to understand why we hold on to our past mistakes long after they've ended, why we're so harsh toward the versions of ourselves who were still learning how to live, and what truly changes when we begin to forgive them. Because forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't about forgetting. It's about seeing clearly and choosing to release the sentence we've imposed on our own humanity. I remember someone I once interviewed years ago, a brilliant teacher in her 50s who had left teaching after a tragic event. She had made a choice in the classroom that, though understandable at the time, led to unintended harm. No legal charges, no scandal, but within her, a moral earthquake. Decades later, she told me she still woke up some nights at 2 a.m., replaying that same moment. "I know I didn't mean it," she told me, "but I can't stop thinking, how did I not see it? How did I let that happen?" Her voice trembled somewhere between confession and exhaustion. As we spoke, it became clear this wasn't simply guilt. It was hindsight bias operating at full force. She remembered the moment through the lens of who she is now, a wiser, more experienced teacher, more aware of systems, emotions, and human fragility. But she wasn't that person then. When the event happened, she was younger, newer, reacting in good faith with the tools she had. But hindsight strips away the context that protected her humanity, replacing it with the false clarity of "I should have known." I told her that her memory of that day was not a recording, but a reconstruction. Every time she revisited it, she mixed fragments of retrospective knowledge into the past, overwriting details to align with her current understanding. This is the essence of reconstructive memory, one of the most studied yet most misunderstood elements of human cognition. Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated that memory is surprisingly pliable. Post-event information doesn't merely influence recall, it reshapes it. So, the more we revisit our mistakes, the more we reauthor them, often in ways that make us seem even more culpable than we truly were. She paused, breathing carefully, absorbing the idea. "So, I've been judging a ghost version of myself," she said softly. That sentence stayed with me. Because that's what so many of us do. We prosecute ghosts. We sentence echoes. We punish the memory, not the moment. The psychological mechanics of this process are intricate. The orbiting planet around hindsight bias is cognitive dissonance, the friction between two inner truths. I am a good person, and I did something that caused harm. Our mind cannot easily hold those two realities, so it seeks to resolve them. One path is understanding, the other is self-condemnation. The first requires compassion, the second demands punishment. Unfortunately, punishment feels simpler. It preserves control. If I can blame myself entirely, then I can believe the world still makes sense. But compassion means surrendering that illusion of control. It requires sitting with chaos. Rumination then becomes the machinery that perpetuates this unresolved tension. It promises resolution, but delivers only repetition. In neuroscience, rumination activates the default mode network, the brain's resting state that engages during self-referential thought. When we ruminate, we're essentially turning inward, replaying internal narratives, activating emotional memories, and reinforcing neural pathways of self-blame. Over time, these networks become like well-worn trails, automatic, comfortable, and difficult to exit. In the teacher's case, each replay of that classroom event was not healing her. It was deepening the groove of guilt, making the memory more vivid, not less painful. The ghost grew stronger because it was fed with attention. Neuroscientifically, neurons that fire together wire together. The more we revisit a memory with guilt and shame, the more tightly these emotions fuse. When I asked her if she'd ever forgiven herself, she frowned. "I don't know how," she whispered. "It feels like letting myself off the hook." This is a fundamental misunderstanding of forgiveness, one I too carried for years. Forgiveness isn't acquittal, it's closure. It's not denying responsibility, it's accepting humanity. But our minds, shaped by evolution to detect threat, are wired toward negativity bias. We give more weight to pain than to peace, more attention to mistakes than to milestones. It's a survival mechanism turned inward, one that, without awareness, becomes self-inflicted suffering. The teacher told me something else that haunts me still. "If I had seen someone else make that same mistake, I would have understood," she said. "But because it was me, I can't." That's cognitive dissonance collapsing on itself, a resistance to applying compassion inward. Our moral wiring demands consistency, but human growth is inherently inconsistent. The mind struggles to reconcile that we can be both the one who caused harm and the one now capable of compassion. Forgiveness, then, isn't a moral act. It's a cognitive one. It's the reconciliation of dissonance. The moment we allow two conflicting truths to coexist, I didn't know, and I regret what happened, something shifts. The tension softens. The inner courtroom begins to dissolve. But before the mind can truly stand down, it must understand the emotional architecture keeping this trial alive. The emotional gravity of our self-anger isn't rational. It's architectural. It's built from the scaffolding of emotion that fuses with cognition. What holds our guilt in place is not logic but feeling, the heart's resistance to moving on when the mind already understands. For years, I wrestled with my own series of what-ifs. They came like waves. What if I had been kinder, wiser, more patient? What if I hadn't made that choice? Counterfactual thinking creates alternate histories that compete with reality itself. In psychology, these imagined alternatives serve an adaptive purpose. They allow us to learn. But when they spiral, they become cages. Instead of learning from them, we live inside them. This is where rumination collides with emotion. Emotional reasoning takes over. When I feel guilt, I assume I must be guilty. When I feel shame, I assume I must deserve it. The emotional brain, particularly the amygdala, does not differentiate between moral culpability and emotional memory. It simply signals threat. That's why our bodies react to memories as though they were current events. The guilt is alive because the body keeps reliving the failure. To forgive yourself, then, is not just philosophical. It's neurological. It's the recalibration of pathways between brain and body. Every time we revisit our past and choose empathy over judgment, we lessen the amygdala's reactivity, strengthen prefrontal regulation, and begin to rewrite the emotional memory. Self-forgiveness is, in that sense, a neuroplastic act. But emotion resists rewriting. I often think of it as an old melody trapped in an echo chamber. Even when the music stops, the resonance lingers. That lingering is the Zeigarnik effect manifesting emotionally. Unfinished business in the soul. A phrase unsaid, an apology never received, a version of ourselves we wish we could apologize to. The echo grows because we never let it end. That teacher I mentioned eventually returned to her classroom, but not as the same teacher. I came back to teach empathy, she told me, because I realized I can't undo my past, but I can teach others how to hold theirs. That statement reflects the transformation of her cognitive dissonance into compassion. The same memory that once punished her became the foundation for her renewed purpose. When I reflect on my own journey, I think of the years I spent angered by the person I used to be. The impulsive decisions, the careless words, the lost opportunities. I thought self-hatred was accountability. It wasn't. It was imprisonment. I had mistaken emotional pain for moral clarity. The irony is, most of us do. We think that to forgive ourselves means to excuse ourselves, when in reality, it means to understand ourselves fully enough to grow beyond self-condemnation. As the teacher found meaning in her pain, I found something similar, an emerging compassion that didn't erase the past, but changed how it lived inside me. As I began to observe my inner courtroom more consciously, I noticed how rehearsed the trial was, how the same evidence, the same self-critical witnesses appeared every time. But something eventually changed. I started questioning the process, not the verdict. Why is this trial still running? Who told me these were crimes that could never expire? That question cracked the architecture of my anger. When I realized that my guilt was not truth but structure, a system built upon memory bias, rumination, and dissonance, I felt both devastation and liberation, because understanding the system meant I could finally step outside it. I was never meant to be my own judge. I was meant to be my own witness. Eventually, I started to see myself differently. Not as the sum of my regrets, but as the author of an evolving narrative. This idea, known in psychology as narrative identity, changed everything. We build our sense of self from the stories we tell about who we've been and who we're becoming. The past doesn't change, but the story does, and with it, its emotional weight. When we rewrite our story through self-compassion, the anger loses its anchor. Self-compassion, as defined by psychologist Kristen Neff, is not indulgence, but courage. The courage to treat oneself with the same kindness one would offer a friend in suffering. It is rooted in three principles: kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. The first acknowledges that mistakes are part of being human. The second reminds us we are not alone in them. The third asks us to stay present, not lost in loops of the past. For me, learning self-compassion felt like switching metaphors, from courtroom to classroom. Instead of sentencing my past self, I began to study them. What did they know? What did they need? What were they afraid of? And what truths were they unable yet to see? Each answer softened something inside me, because once you see your past self as a learner and not a villain, forgiveness begins naturally. I often guide my mind through a quiet ritual when old memories surface. I imagine that inner courtroom once more, but this time the prosecutor steps aside, and I approach the witness stand, not to accuse, but to listen. I place my hand over the table and say, "You did what you could with what you knew." The silence that follows feels sacred, as though the ghost finally hears the words it's waited for all these years. Self-forgiveness is not a destination. It's a practice. Every time we replace judgment with curiosity, every time we remind ourselves that knowing better now does not mean we should have known then, we're retraining the brain toward peace. It takes repetition, just like self-criticism once did. We've practiced punishment unconsciously for years. Forgiveness deserves at least the same devotion. I sometimes think of forgiveness as a physiological exhale, a release the nervous system has been craving all along. The tightness in the chest softens. The body finally believes the trial is over. And it is, not because we found ourselves innocent, but because we accepted our humanity as it is. Over time, something beautiful happens. The memory that once triggered shame begins to evoke tenderness. You start to feel gratitude toward your past self, not for their mistakes, but for their endurance. They carried you here. They stumbled so you could see. They erred so you could evolve. That's the quiet grace of being a continuously learning mind. So if you find yourself haunted by the ghost of who you used to be, try this. Step into that inner courtroom one more time, only to dissolve it. Lay down the gavel, release the witnesses, gather the shards of broken verdicts, and let them be rewritten as lessons, not life sentences. Then say, "The trial has ended. I am free to begin again." I used to be so angry with myself. Now I'm learning to forgive me. Not because I deserve it more than others, but because forgiveness is the only way to keep growing. The mind does not heal by erasing, it heals by integrating. Every version of who we've been is an unfinished draft of who we are becoming. We can honor those drafts for what they were, necessary, imperfect, and honest. And if you're listening to this thinking of your own past, the words you regret, the choices that still hurt, know this: you're not broken, you're human. The fact that you still care means growth is already in motion. Now take a deep breath. The courtroom doors are open. Leave them behind. Step into the world of now. If this reflection spoke to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it too, someone who's still holding their own trial in their head. Our stories are lighter when carried together.